Chapter 1. The Mud of Jabim. The sky above Jabim cracked open, revealing a bleeding wound in reality that wept not blood, but a torrent of unrelenting, acidic rain. It was a rupture in the cosmic order, a violent tear through which a soul forged in the fires of earthly wars was thrust back into the mortal coil. There was no white light, no choir of angels, only the thunderous applause of artillery and the familiar copper tang of spilled life. The entity known as George S. Patton did not drift into this new existence. He collided with it. He woke not with a gasp, but with a snarl, his consciousness slamming into a body that was racked with pain, a vessel of flesh and bone that felt both alien and strangely capable. The darkness of the void receded, replaced by the sterile, blinding white of a medical tent and the rhythmic hissing of machinery that sounded like the breathing of iron beasts. He tried to sit up, but a restraining field hummed, pushing him back against the cold slab. His vision blurred, swimming in a haze of back-to-fluid and residual shock. Above him, a metallic face peered down, a mockery of the human form with glowing photoreceptors and a voice that grated like tin scraping against slate. "General Krell, you must remain still." The machine droned its logic processors, unable to comprehend the storm that had just ignited within the patient's mind. "Your vital signs are stabilizing, but the neural shock was severe." Patton blinked the fog clearing. He remembered a car crash in Germany, the paralysis, the frustration of a warrior dying in a bed. But this was not a hospital in Heidelberg. The air smelled of ozone-burnt plastic and the heavy oppressive musk of wet earth. He flexed his hands. They were large, calloused, strong. He felt the phantom weight of his ivory-handled revolvers, but they were gone. "General Krell." He rasped, his voice sounding deeper, rougher than he remembered. It was a voice made for shouting over the roar of tank engines. "Who the hell is Krell?" He tore through the restraining field with a surge of adrenaline that set the monitors screaming. He was not Krell. He was Patton. And God, in his infinite wisdom and dark humor, had seen fit to redeploy him. The medical droid recoiled its servos, whining in protest as the large man swung his legs off the table. Patton stood swaying slightly, the medical gown fluttering around his frame. He looked down at himself. The uniform hanging on the nearby rack was strange tunics and armor plates, but the insignia of rank was unmistakable. A general. Good. That was the only thing that mattered. He ignored the droid's frantic warnings and grabbed the tunic, pulling it over his head. It felt synthetic, lacking the honest scratch of wool, but it would serve. He needed to see the battlefield. He needed to see the war. He shoved past the droid, his bare feet slapping against the cold metal floor, and burst through the tent flaps into the world outside. The assault on his senses was immediate and absolute. Jabim was a nightmare of mud and gray misery. The rain fell in sheets, a relentless deluge that turned the ground into a churning quagmire of filth. Lightning arced across the purple-bruised sky, illuminating a scene of organized despair. Everywhere he looked, men in white armor, identical, faceless men were digging. They were huddled in trenches, filling sandbags, reinforcing bunkers. They were hiding. The sight hit Patton like a physical blow. It was the Somme all over again. It was the stagnation of trench warfare, the very antithesis of everything he believed in. Digging, he spat the word, tasting like bile. They are digging their own graves. He marched into the mud, the cold rain soaking him instantly, but he didn't feel the chill. He felt only the heat of indignation. Soldiers' clones. His mind supplied the term, though he didn't know how. He knew it snapped to attention as he passed their helmets, tilting in surprise at the sight of their commander walking barefoot in the sludge. He ignored them, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, flashes of red and blue light erupted, followed by the dull thud of explosions. The enemy was out there, and his army was here, cowering in the dirt. He spotted a command center, a chaotic hub of hollow tables and shouting officers, and made straight for it. Inside the command tent, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of fear and damp electronics. A hologram flickered in the center, displaying a tactical map. There was a sea of red markers surrounding a shrinking island of blue. A clone officer, his armor painted with the distinct markings of a commander, was arguing with a hologram of a robed figure. "General, we cannot hold Sector 4, the clone was saying, his voice modulated and calm, too calm. "The droids are overwhelming our flank. We need to retreat to the secondary line." "Retreat." Patton's voice boomed across the tent, silencing the comms chatter. The robed hologram turned, and the clone commander froze. Patton strode to the table, leaning over the map with a predator's intensity. He didn't know the terrain, he didn't know the enemy, but he knew the geometry of war. He pointed a thick finger at the map. "You do not retreat unless you are dead, and even then, I expect your corpse to fall forward." He looked at the clone commander, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you, son?" "Commander Alpha, sir," the clone replied, confused, but instinctively straightening his spine. "We thought..." "The medical droid reported you were critical." "The only thing critical here is this pathetic display of defeatism," Patton growled. He looked at the map again. "You're giving up ground to buy time. Time for what? To die later, to let the enemy consolidate." He grabbed a stylus from the table and slashed a line across the holographic projection, cutting through the red markers. "We don't hold. We advance. We attack." The robed figure in the hologram spoke up, a voice filled with concern and a sickening amount of pacifist hesitation. "General Krell, this is reckless. The droid army outnumbers you 10-1. To attack now is suicide." Patton peered at the hologram. A Jedi, he knew the word, and with it came a surge of instinctive disdain. Mystics, philosophers, people who tried to impose morality on the chaotic mechanics of slaughter. "I don't know who you are." Patton said, his voice low and dangerous, "but don't you ever talk to me about odds. Numbers are for accountants. War is about spirit. It's about violence of action." He swiped his hand through the hologram, severing the connection. The image of the Jedi fizzled and died. "I don't need a priest telling me how to kill." He turned back to Alpha. The clone was staring at him, not with fear, but with a sudden sharp curiosity. The programming in the clone's mind was clashing with the erratic, fiery presence of the general. "Give me a situation report, Commander. And don't give me statistics. Tell me where the bastards are." "They are entrenched on the ridge," Sir Alpha said, pointing to the high ground. "Hailfire droids and AATs. They have superior range. Our walkers are bogged down in the mud." "Bogged down?" Patton laughed, a short barking sound that had no humor in it. "Equipment is only bogged down if the driver lacks the will to move it." He looked around the tent, his eyes landing on a rack of weapons. He walked over and picked up a DC-17 hand blaster. He weighed it in his hand, frowning. It felt light, insubstantial. A toy made of plastic and plasma. "No weight," he muttered. "No recoil. How can a man feel the consequence of his shot with this?" He tossed it back onto the table with a clatter. "Find me a slug thrower, or at least a solid metal rod. I need something I can feel." He walked out of the command tent again, Alpha trailing close behind. The rain had intensified, drumming a deafening rhythm against the metal crates. But Patton's eyes were fixed on the motor pool. There, sitting idle in the mud, were the machines of this war. Massive six-legged walkers, ITTEs. They were ugly, ungainly beasts, resembling insects more than chariots of war. but they were heavily armored and bristling with cannons. Patton watched them, his mind stripping away the alien design and seeing the tactical reality. Mobile pillboxes, heavy cavalry. He walked up to the lead walker, slapping his hand against the wet, cold durasteel of its leg. It was solid. It was real. Tanks, he whispered the word, a prayer on his lips. They look like beetles, but they have the heart of a tiger. He turned to Alpha Rain, dripping from his nose, his eyes burning with a manic, infectious light. You treat them like artillery, Patton accused. You sit them back and fire over the hills. That is a waste of steel. Sir, the terrain, Alpha began. The terrain is an excuse. Patton roared his voice, cutting through the storm. God created the mud to test the infantry, but he created the tank to conquer the mud. He looked up at the turret of the walker, visualizing the devastation it could cause at point-blank range. He imagined these steel beasts not crawling, but charging their cannons, blasting holes in the enemy line, crushing the metallic skeletons of the droids under their heavy feet. Get the crews ready, Commander Patton ordered, wiping the rain from his face. Paint the noses of these walkers. I want them red. Or yellow, something bright. I want those tin can sons of bitches on the ridge to see us coming. Sir Alpha hesitated. Regulation state? To hell with regulations. Patton slammed his fist against the walker's leg again. I want the enemy to know who is killing them. I want them to see the whites of our... well, the paint on our hulls. He looked out toward the ridge where the flashes of enemy fire were getting closer. He didn't feel the ache in his new body anymore. He felt the familiar vibration of destiny. This was not a mistake. This was a promotion. He had been given a galaxy of endless war, an army of soldiers bred for nothing else, and enemies that didn't bleed, meaning he could kill them without a shred of remorse. Don't talk to me about survival ratios, Captain Patton shouted, correcting the rank in his fervor. Just tell me where the bastards are so I can kill them. He looked back at the ATTE, a twisted smile forming on his lips. They're big clumsy things, he said more to himself than to the clones gathering around him. But by God, I'll teach them to dance. He climbed up the side of the walker, ignoring the ladder, pulling himself up by the sheer strength of his arms. He stood on the hull, a lone figure against the tempest, looking down at the army of identical faces. They were waiting for an order. They were waiting for a leader. Listen to me. He bellowed, his voice amplified by the strange acoustics of the valley. We are not holding this position. We are not digging any more holes. Tonight, we are going to drive these machines down their throats. We are going to grease our treads with their oil. The lightning flashed, casting a long, jagged shadow behind him. For a moment, the clones didn't move. Then slowly, the fear in the air began to change. It curdled into something else. Something dangerous. Something like hope mixed with madness. General Patton stood on the precipice of a new war, and for the first time in a long time, the galaxy held its breath. The crusade had begun. Chapter 2. Discipline of Iron. The interior of the Hawkbat Battalion's barracks smelled of wet plastoid recycled air and the stale odor of waiting. It was a smell George Patton knew well. It was the scent of an army that had forgotten it was a predator. He strode through the blast doors, the metal strut he had ripped from a wreckage earlier, clutched in his hand like a swagger stick. The rhythmic tapping of the metal against his thigh cut through the low hum of the ventilation systems. 10 Hut, a voice barked, Commander Alpha. In a singular fluid motion that defied the laws of biology, 200 men rose from their bunks and snapped to attention. The sound was a singular crack like a rifle shot. Patton stopped in the center of the aisle, his eyes sweeping over the ranks. They were perfect. Too perfect. They stood like statues, their white armor gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, their helmets tucked under their left arms. and their faces. That was the thing that unsettled him the most. He walked down the line, peering into eyes that were copies of one another. The same jawline, the same nose, the same haircut. It was a nightmare of industrial production applied to humanity. At ease, Patton grumbled, though his posture remained rigid. The troopers relaxed slightly, but their eyes remained fixed forward. Patton stopped in front of a young trooper whose armor was scuffed. "What is your name, son?" "CT-4429, sir," the trooper shouted, staring straight ahead. Patton grimaced as if he had tasted sour milk. "I didn't ask for the barcode stamped on your ass by the factory," he growled, leaning in close, his nose inches from the troopers. "I asked for your name. What do your brothers call you when the officers aren't looking?" The trooper hesitated, a flicker of confusion breaking his programming. "Stubb, sir? Because I lost a finger on Geonosis." "Stubb," Patton repeated, nodding slowly. "Good. A name means you have a soul. A number is just an item on a ledger to be written off." He turned to address the room, his voice rising. "I don't care what the Republic calls you. I don't care what the Kaminoans programmed you to think. In this army, you are men, and I will not lead machines. Machines break. Men die, but they die with purpose." He continued his inspection, his pace quickening. He wasn't looking for dirty boots or unpolished buttons. He was looking for fire. He found only discipline cold, sterile, and brittle. They were drilled to follow orders, not to seize opportunities. They were reactive, waiting for a Jedi to wave a laser sword or a computer to calculate the odds. It disgusted him. He reached the end of the line and turned to Commander Alpha, who was shadowing him with a datapad in hand. "They are soft, Commander," Patton stated flatly. Alpha stiffened. "With respect, General, the Hawk Bat Battalion has the highest efficiency rating in the sector. We follow protocol to the letter." "Protocol?" Patton spat the word out. He slammed his makeshift baton against a bunk frame, the clang ringing out violently. "Protocol tells you how to march in a parade. It doesn't tell you how to rip the throat out of the enemy. You have the highest efficiency rating because you don't take risks. You don't push. You wait." He gestured to the door. "Outside, all of them. Full kit. Now." The rain had not let up. If anything, the Jabiim sky had decided to drown the world in gray misery. The mud in the motor pool was ankle-deep, a sucking, churning sludge that threatened to pull boots right off feet. Patton stood in the downpour, water streaming off his face, ignoring the poncho a medic tried to offer him. He watched as the battalion formed up in the mud, their white armor instantly splattered with filth. Patton walked over to the line of ATTE walkers. They were parked in defensive intervals, hunkered down behind berms. They were covered in grime oil streaks running down their flanks like black tears. He ran a hand along the hull of the lead walker, then looked at his palm. It was black with grease. "Who is responsible for this vehicle?" Patton demanded, his voice dangerously low. A clone lieutenant stepped forward. "Sir LT-09, Logistics and Maintenance." Patton wiped his greasy hand on the lieutenant's pristine white chest plate, leaving a dark, jagged smear. The troopers nearby flinched. "You let your mount get this filthy," Patton roared. "This is not a tractor. This is a warship on legs. How do you expect it to protect you if you don't respect it?" "General, the environmental conditions," the lieutenant stammered. "The environment is the enemy," Patton cut him off. "You fight the mud just like you fight the droids. If you let the rust take hold, you are surrendering." He pointed the baton at the walker's heavy front cannons. "And look at this gray, dull, boring gray. You look like the mud. You look like part of the landscape." He turned to Alpha. "Get paint. Red, yellow. I don't care as long as it screams." Alpha blinked the rain, sluicing off his helmet. "Paint, sir. The Regulation Manual, Section 4. Paragraph 2. explicitly states that vehicle camouflage must match the planetary biome to minimize visual signature. Minimize visual signature. Patton laughed a sound that cracked like thunder. Commander, I don't want to hide from those tin cans. I want them to know I am coming. I want them to look through their binoculars and wet their oil pans because they see the devil himself driving a golden chariot. He jabbed the baton into Alpha's chest plate. The enemy fights with logic. They calculate targeting based on standard profiles. We are going to change the profile. We are going to be so visible, so arrogant, that their logic circuits won't know how to process the sheer audacity of it. Paint the noses, Patton ordered, sweeping his arm across the line of walkers. Shark mouths, thunderbolts, skulls. Make them look like monsters. If we are going to hell, we are going to ride there in style. An hour later, the battalion was not resting. They were running. Patton had ordered a forced march, not on the reinforced paths, but through the deepest trenches of the swamp. He ran at the head of the column, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his new heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. His lungs burned with the acidic tang of the air, but he refused to stop. The clones genetically engineered for peak physical condition were struggling not with the exertion, but with the confusion. Why were they doing this? Why deplete energy reserves before a battle? But as they watched the general, this non-clone, this natural human slogging through the muck with a manic grin on his face, something shifted. He wasn't commanding from the rear. He was suffering with them. Pick up the pace, Patton yelled, vaulting over a fallen log. The enemy isn't sleeping, and the enemy is charging his batteries. Do you want to die tired, or do you want to live as conquerors? He saw a trooper stumble weighed down by a heavy rotary cannon. The man fell face first into the slime. Before anyone else could move, Patton was there. He didn't offer a hand to help the man up. He grabbed the handle of the rotary cannon and hauled the weapon up himself, throwing the heavy gun over his own shoulder. "Get up," Patton roared at the fallen trooper. "Your weapon is your life. You drop it, you die. Now move." The trooper scrambled up, shame and adrenaline fueling him. Patton carried the heavy cannon for a full mile, his boots sinking deep, his jaw set in a rictus of determination. The clones watched in silence, their internal comms buzzing with a new kind of chatter. This wasn't standard operating procedure. This was madness. But it was a madness that made them feel invincible. By the time they returned to the perimeter, the sun was setting behind the storm clouds, casting a blood-red hue over the camp. The men were exhausted, covered in mud, breathing hard. But they stood taller. The uniformity was gone, replaced by the shared bond of distinct misery. Patton handed the rotary cannon back to the trooper, wiping his hands on his tunic. He climbed onto a crate, looking out over the sea of white helmets now stained brown and gray. "You are tired," Patton said, his voice raspy but carrying to the back ranks. "Good. Pain is the only reminder that you are still alive." He pointed toward the ridgeline where the enemy lights flickered in the dusk. "Those machines up there, they don't feel pain. They don't feel fear. And that is why they will lose." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "We are not staying here. We are not reinforcing these bunkers. Tonight you sleep, you eat, you check your gear. Because tomorrow morning we are breaking camp." A ripple of unease went through the ranks. To leave the fortified zone was suicide, according to every tactical simulation. "We don't hold this position." Patton growled, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "We are going to attack. We are going to hit them so hard and so fast that their processors won't have time to send a distress signal." He looked at Alpha, then back to the troops. "Tomorrow, gentlemen, we will not be eating ration bars in the mud. Tomorrow we will be eating breakfast in the ruination of their guts." Dismissed. As the troops dispersed, the energy in the camp had changed. It was no longer the static electricity of anxiety. It was the hum of a high-voltage line waiting to discharge. Patton stepped down from the crate, his legs trembling slightly from the exertion, but his spirit soaring. He looked at the ATTEs, where crews were already defying regulations, applying bright red primer to the armored hulls in the pouring rain. Patton smiled. The crusade had its knights. Now they just needed a holy war. Chapter 3. Blitzkrieg on Repulsor Lift. The dawn on Jabiim did not break. It merely bruised the sky, a lighter shade of violent violet. The rain continued its eternal bombardment, but the sound was now drowned out by a deeper mechanical resonance. The Hawkbat Battalion was not in their bunkers. They were mounted. 12 ATTE walkers stood in a wedge formation, their engines revving to a pitch that threatened to strip their gears. And they had changed. The drab factory standard gray was gone, replaced by hastily applied garish war paint. Crimson jaws lined with jagged white teeth gaped open on the prows of the lead walkers. Yellow lightning bolts streaked down the flanks of others. It was a visual desecration of Republic regulations, and it was the most beautiful thing George Patton had ever seen. Patton stood on the hull of the lead walker christened the War Daddy. In messy Aurebesh scrawled across the turret. He refused the safety of the interior command pod. He wore a headset clamped over his ears, a stolen heavy blaster rifle slung across his back, and a pair of macro binoculars in his hands. He looked like a barbarian king riding a prehistoric beast. Below him, inside the Walker Commander Alpha, watched the tactical display with a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. General Alpha's voice crackled over the comms hull. Integrity is compromised by your position. If we take a direct hit, Commander, I won't have to worry about the paperwork. Patton shouted back, his voice cutting through the wind. Driver, I don't want a slow approach. When I give the signal, you drop the hammer. I want this beast to scream, and he looked at the muddy expanse between them and the droid lines, 2 miles of treacherous soup-like sludge. The droids calculated it would take an hour to cross. Patton intended to cross it in 10 minutes or die trying. Forward, Patton bellowed, waving his arm like a cavalry saber. Pour it on. The drivers, infected by the general's madness, slammed the throttles forward. The ATTEs lurched their massive legs, digging into the muck, finding traction where there should have been none. They didn't walk. They lunged. The sheer momentum carried them forward, the repulsor lift stabilizers whining in protest as they fought to keep the multi-ton behemoths upright. It wasn't a march. It was a stampede of iron elephants. On the ridge, a B-series tactical droid observed the approaching cloud of steam and mud. Its processors whirred, analyzing the data. Republic forces are advancing it, intoned to the battery of Hailfire droids. Vector 4-4. Speed, irregular. Formation, illogical. The algorithm predicted the clones would stop at the first berm for cover. That was the rule. That was the program. But the red-nosed monsters didn't stop. They accelerated. The tactical droid reran the simulation. Error. Does not compute. Fire all batteries, it ordered, a hint of electronic panic in its vocal synthesizer. Target the lead vehicle. Missiles streaked from the ridge, leaving corkscrews of smoke in the rain. Patton saw them coming. He didn't flinch. Driver hard, left drift it, he screamed. The pilot, acting on instinct rather than training, locked the left legs and gunned the right drive motors. The ATTE didn't turn. It slid. The massive walker drifted sideways across the mud like a rally car on ice, a maneuver physically impossible on dry ground, but perfectly executed on the lubricant of the Jabiim swamp. The missiles slammed into the mud where the walker had been a second before, sending geysers of steam and dirt into the air. Ha! Patton roared, shaking his fist at the sky. "You missed, you rust bucket bastards. You shoot like old women." He tapped his headset. "All units don't stop to aim. Fire on the move. Suppression only. Keep their heads down until we can smell their exhaust fumes." The Republic line erupted in blue plasma. They weren't aiming for specific targets. They were creating a wall of energy. The droids, rigid in their programming, struggled to track the erratic sliding movement of the walkers. The blitzkrieg, a word Patton had whispered to Alpha earlier, was in full effect. It was violence of speed. The distance closed rapidly. 1 mile, half a mile, quarter mile. The droids' heavy artillery became useless as the walkers got under their minimum firing range. Now Patton yelled, slapping the hull. "Point blank. Give them the good news." The ATTEs crashed into the first line of droid infantry. They didn't slow down. The massive feet of the walkers crushed B-1 battle droids into scrap metal, the sound of crunching chassis sickeningly audible. The main cannons, now at suicidal close range, fired directly into the hulls of the enemy AAT tanks. There was no need for targeting computers. At 10 meters, you don't miss. The explosions were instantaneous and catastrophic. Turrets flew off tanks spinning like coins. Droids were vaporized in the backwash of the heavy mass driver cannons. Patton unslung his rifle. A spider droid loomed over the war daddy, its laser eye charging. Patton didn't seek cover. He planted his feet on the vibrating hull, aimed at the droid's photoreceptor, and squeezed the trigger. The bolt hit home, blinding the machine. A second later, the walker's top gunner finished it off with a rotary blast that sawed the droid's legs off. Timber Patton laughed, the sound manic and joyous. That's how you clear a forest. The battle was a chaotic, swirling melee of mud and metal. The structured lines of the separatists collapsed into anarchy. They couldn't flank because the Republic forces were everywhere, at once driving through their formations, turning, firing, and driving again. It was a brawl. It was ugly, messy, and brutally effective. The tactical droid on the ridge watched as its probability of victory plummeted from 98% to 0% in the span of 4 minutes. Retreat, it calculated. Preserve assets. But Patton wasn't interested in letting them retreat. He saw the command post attempting to pull back. "Alpha, the flank," he ordered. "Cut off their escape. I want that tin can's head for a hood ornament." 2 AT-Ts broke from the pack, sliding through a ravine to block the pass. The trap snapped shut. The droids were encircled. Silence fell over the battlefield as the last AAT burned its ammunition, cooking off in sporadic pops. The rain reclaimed the soundscape, sizzling on the hot armor of the walkers. Patton stood atop his metal steed, his chest heaving, his face smeared with grease and soot. He looked out over the field of wreckage, burning husks of droids stretching for a mile. There were no Republic losses. A few dents, a few scorched plates, but no dead men. He climbed down from the hull, his boots splashing into the mud, which was now mixed with oil and coolant. Commander Alpha emerged from the walker, removing his helmet. The clone looked at the carnage, then at the general. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated. He had never seen warfare like this. It was reckless. It was insane. And it was absolute victory. Sir Alpha said, his voice trembling slightly. "The sector is clear. We have advanced 10 miles in 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Patton checked an imaginary watch on his wrist, scowling. We were slow in the middle. We'll work on the transmission gearing. He patted Alpha on the shoulder, a heavy paternal slap. But you did good, son. You drove like a madman. Alpha looked at the burning droids. We broke every protocol in the manual, General. And that, Patton said, pointing to the horizon where a Republic dropship was descending through the clouds, is why we are alive to talk about it. He watched the ship land. He recognized the signature. It was a Jedi shuttle. The reinforcements had arrived too late to save him, but just in time to see what a real army looked like. Patton straightened his tunic, wiping the grime from his rank plaque. "Looks like the wizards are here," he muttered, watching the ramp of the shuttle lower. "Let's go say hello. And Alpha, don't you dare wash that paint off. That's our colors now." "Yes, sir," Alpha replied. And for the first time, there was a hint of pride in the clone's voice that had nothing to do with genetic programming. Hawkbat Battalion stands ready. Chapter 4. The Sorcerer and the General. The ramp of the new class attack shuttle hissed as it lowered onto the churning mud of Jabeem, releasing a blast of pressurized sterile air into the humid rot of the atmosphere. Anakin Skywalker pulled his hood tight against the relentless downpour, his boots sinking instantly into the mire. Beside him, Ahsoka Tano shivered, hugging her arms against the chill. They had come expecting a disaster. The reports from Jabeem had been catastrophic: a dead general, a routed army, a hopeless siege. Anakin had prepared himself to salvage a retreat to hold the line with his lightsaber, while clones died in the mud. What he saw instead was a carnival of aggression. The landing zone was not a place of defeat. It was a hive of frantic manic industry. Mechanics were welding armor plates onto walkers in the pouring rain, sparks cascading like fireworks. And the walkers? Anakin stopped blinking water from his eyelashes. The ATTEs were defaced. Garish red shark mouths, yellow lightning bolts, and crude slogans in Orabesh screamed from the hulls. It looked less like the Grand Army of the Republic and more like a swoop gang's garage. Master Ahsoka whispered, pointing to a stack of destroyed battle droids piled high like a bonfire waiting to be lit. Did the 501st get here before us?" "No," Anakin murmured, his eyes scanning the camp. He reached out with the Force, expecting to find the damp gray fear that usually permeated a siege. Instead, he felt a fire. It was a jagged, raw, and undisciplined burning in the Force, a collective aggression that felt dangerously close to the dark side, yet entirely devoid of its malice. It was just anger. Pure, focused anger. "Come on, Snips. Let's find General Krell before he gets himself killed." They found the command center not by the comms signature, but by the shouting. A voice, gravelly and booming, was tearing through the canvas walls of the main tent, drowning out the thunder. "I don't care what the manual says about stress fractures," the voice roared. "If the axle breaks, you weld it. If the weld breaks you, tie it together with your own intestines if you have to. But that tank moves at Oro 600. Anakin pushed through the tent flaps, Ahsoka at his heels. The scene inside was chaos, controlled by a single, imposing figure. A large basilisk, General Krell, stood over a terrified logistics droid. But this wasn't the Krell Anakin had heard rumors of. This man didn't move like a Jedi. He didn't carry himself with the monk-like serenity of the Order. He stood with his hands on his hips, his chest puffed out, radiating an aura of absolute terrifying authority. He was wearing a grease-stained tunic, and a primitive slug-thrower pistol was strapped to his hip, a barbarian's weapon. General Krell Anakin announced, stepping into the light of the holotable. "I am General Skywalker. This is Commander Tano. The Council sent us to relieve you." The large man turned slowly. He didn't bow. He didn't offer the traditional Jedi greeting. He looked Anakin up and down, his eyes lingering on the lightsaber clipped to Anakin's belt with a look of profound distaste. "Relieve me?" Patton scoffed, turning back to the map. "Son, I just relieved the enemy of their dignity. I don't need relief. I need fuel, I need ammunition, and I need this rain to stop for 5 damned minutes." "We read the reports." General Ahsoka stepped forward, her voice firm. "You've suffered a severe head injury. The medics said you were delirious." Delirious. Patton grabbed a metal pointer and slammed it onto the holomap, making the image of the terrain jump. Is it delirious to flank the enemy? Is it madness to kill the bastards before they kill you? If that's insanity, then lock me up, but wait until I've won this war. He glared at Ahsoka. And who are you, a mascot? I am a Padawan learner. Ahsoka snapped her leku, flushing darker. A child. Patton grunted. Great. They send me a boy and a child to fight a machine army. He looked at Anakin. Tell me, General Skywalker, do you know how to lead a tank division, or do you just wave that laser sword around and hope the enemy drops dead from awe? Anakin felt a spike of irritation. He was the hero with no fear. He was the chosen one. He wasn't used to being talked down to by a man who smelled like engine grease and wet dog. I've led men into battles you couldn't imagine, Krell. Anakin said, his voice dropping an octave. And I don't sacrifice my troops for glory. Your charge this morning, it was reckless. You exposed your entire flank. You got lucky. Luck is the residue of design. Patton roared back, stepping into Anakin's personal space. He was taller, broader, and though he lacked the force, his presence was suffocating. You call it reckless because you value safety. Safety is a myth. Safety is for the history books, not the battlefield. You want to save lives, you end the war. Quickly, violently. He pointed a thick finger at Anakin's chest. You Jedi, you're all the same. You treat war like a duel, a dance. You worry about rules of engagement. I don't care about rules. I care about results. Anakin stared at him. He tried to sense the man's mind to push past the bluster. But there was a wall there. Not a mental shield, but a wall of absolute concrete conviction. Patton didn't believe in the Force. He believed in himself so fiercely that the Force seemed to slide off him. We are taking command, General Anakin said coldly. That is a direct order from the High Council. The Council isn't here. Patton said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I am. And until you can show me you can do something other than preach, you are a guest in my army. He turned back to the map, dismissing the chosen one with a wave of his hand. Now, if you want to be useful, look at this. The enemy is regrouping at Sector 7, a fortress. Anakin looked at the map. It was a kill box, a heavily fortified ridge with overlapping fields of fire. You can't attack that, Anakin said, his tactical mind taking over despite his anger. It's a suicidal approach. You'd need air support we don't have. That's exactly why they won't expect a ground assault. Patton grinned, and for a moment the expression was truly demonic. We're going to hit them right up the middle. Straight into the teeth. That's madness, Ahsoka said, horrified. No, little lady. Patton picked up his helmet, a standard clone bucket that he had painted with 4 stars. That's war. And I intend to be good at it. He looked at Anakin, his eyes challenging. Are you coming, sorcerer, or are you going to stay here and polish your glow stick? Anakin looked at the map and then at the man. He hated the arrogance. He hated the disrespect. But deep down in a part of his soul, he rarely acknowledged a dark spark of admiration ignited. This man wanted to win, at any cost. And that was a language Anakin Skywalker understood perfectly. Chapter 5. No sympathy for the devil. The target was a cluster of mud brick hovels huddled in the valley, a settlement of Jabaimi locals that had the misfortune of existing at a tactical crossroads. Through the electro-binoculars, the situation was grimly clear. B-1 battle droids patrolled the perimeter, their metallic skeletal frames glistening in the relentless downpour. But they were not alone. Tied to the barricades, shivering in the freezing mud, were civilians. Women, children, the elderly, a living wall of flesh erected to stop the Republic's advance. The Separatists had learned. They had calculated the morality of their enemy and weaponized it. Patton lowered the binoculars, his face a mask of granite. He stood on the ridge, the wind whipping his coat, a customized clone poncho that looked suspiciously like a trench coat. Beside him, Anakin Skywalker stared down at the village, his knuckles white as he gripped his belt. Ahsoka Tano used the Force to enhance her vision, her expression twisting into horror. "They're using them as shields?" She whispered, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. "Cowards. Smart cowards." Patton grunted, spitting a stream of calf-stained saliva into the mud. "They know you Jedi suffer from a surplus of conscience. They're betting on you blinking first." He turned to the artillery officer standing by the mobile mortar array. "Target the perimeter. High explosive shells. Mix in white phosphorus smoke to blind the sensors. General, wait." Anakin stepped in front of Patton, his hand raised. "You can't shell that position. The blast radius will kill the civilians. We need a strike team. Ahsoka and I can slip in through the sewers, disable the command droid, and free the hostages before the main assault." Patton looked at Anakin with eyes that had seen the hedgerows of Normandy and the snows of Bastogne. He saw a brave boy, but a naive soldier. "Sneaking around in the dark is for thieves, Skywalker," Patton growled. "While you are crawling through excrement, those droids are digging in. If we wait, they reinforce. If they reinforce, we lose the momentum. And if we lose momentum, more people die." "These are innocent lives," Anakin argued, his voice rising. "We are here to protect them. We are here to win a war." Patton roared his voice, silencing the surrounding troopers. "War is not a rescue mission. It is the administration of violence. You want to save those people. Then you kill the thing holding the gun to their heads, and you do it so terrifyingly fast that the enemy forgets to pull the trigger." He turned back to the artillery officer. "Fire mission. Danger close. Walking barrage. Start 50 meters in front of the hostages and walk it through the droid lines. Make the earth shake." "Sir, that is against the rules of engagement." The clone officer hesitated, looking from the Jedi to the general. Patton drew his slug thrower, not aiming it, but holding it with intent. "I am the rules of engagement. Fire the damn guns." The first volley did not hit the village. It screamed over the heads of the hostages and slammed into the ground 50 yards beyond them, right into the concentration of AAT tanks parked in the square. The ground heaved. The sound was not a bang, but a physical tear in the atmosphere. Mud, metal, and droid parts were hurled into the air. The hostages screamed, huddled against the barricades, but the shockwave knocked the droids guarding them off their feet. "Move!" Patton screamed into his comlink, signaling the ATTEs waiting in the tree line. "Forward, crush them before they know they're dead." The tanks surged forward, engines roaring. Anakin stared in disbelief. It was madness. It was a sledgehammer used to crack a nut. But as the droids scrambled, disoriented by the concussive force of the shelling, their coordination collapsed. They weren't executing hostages. They were trying to survive the rain of fire. "He's insane," Anakin muttered, then ignited his lightsaber. "Come on, Ahsoka. We have to get down there before his artillery misses." The Jedi leaped from the ridge, descending into the chaos. They moved like blurs of light, deflecting stray shrapnel and slicing through the droids that were staggering from the bombardment. Down in the valley, the battle was a one-sided massacre. Patton's shock and awe doctrine was in full effect. The droids, programmed to fight logical battles against logical opponents, could not process the sheer ferocity of the assault. Shells were landing dangerously close to the hostages, covering them in mud and debris. But the shrapnel was tearing the droids apart. Patton rode the lead tank again, his face illuminated by the flashes of the cannons. He wasn't smiling. This was work. Grim, necessary work. He watched as a super battle droid raised its arm to fire at a group of fleeing civilians. Before the droid could cycle its weapon, a high-velocity slug from Patton's sniper team took its head off. "Keep moving," Patton yelled. "Don't let them breathe, don't let them think." Anakin and Ahsoka reached the hostages. Ahsoka severed the bindings of a Jabiimi woman, who clung to the Padawan, sobbing in terror. "It's okay," Ahsoka soothed, shouting over the roar of the tanks. "We're here." But the woman wasn't looking at the droids with fear anymore. She was looking at the Republic tanks that were flattening the village huts to get a better firing angle. The liberation looked indistinguishable from destruction. Within 10 minutes, it was over. The Separatist force was not just defeated, it was erased. The village was a smoking ruin, the ground churned into a moonscape. But the hostages, covered in mud, deafened by the noise and terrified beyond measure, were alive. Patton climbed down from his tank, his boots crunching on the wreckage of a droideka. He walked through the smoke, the smell of cordite and ozone thick in the air. He found Anakin standing amidst the shivering civilians. The Jedi Knight looked furious. "You almost killed them," Anakin accused, pointing his deactivated hilt at Patton. "A 3-degree error in your artillery calculation, and this would be a graveyard." Patton took a cigar from his pocket, a rare luxury he had scavenged, and lit it with the heat of a burning droid chassis. He took a long drag, exhaling a cloud of blue smoke that mingled with the fog of war. "Almost counts only in horseshoes and hand grenades," General Skywalker, Patton said calmly. "Did they die?" "They are traumatized," Ahsoka shouted. "Look at them. They're terrified of us. They are alive." Patton stated, his voice devoid of apology. "They will go home. They will cry. They will have nightmares. But they will live to breed and rebuild. If we had tried your way sneaking in the shadows, the droids would have detected you. A firefight would have broken out at close range. Civilians would have been caught in the crossfire. We would be counting bodies right now instead of blessings." He walked past the Jedi, kneeling down in front of a small Jabiimi child who was staring at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. Patton reached into his pouch and pulled out a ration bar, handing it to the kid. He didn't offer a soft smile. He offered a nod of respect. "War is hell, son," Patton said to the boy, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Don't let anyone sell you the glory. But remember who stood in the fire to get you out." He stood up and turned back to Anakin. "You fight for their souls, Skywalker. That's noble. I fight for their lives. And right now, their lives are secure." He gestured to the burning horizon where the rest of the Separatist army was waiting. "Now mount up. We have them on the run. You don't give the enemy time to mourn." Anakin watched the general walk away, the heavy coat billowing behind him like the cape of a conqueror. He felt a disturbance in the Force, a conflict within himself. He hated Patton's methods. They were crude, brutal, and lacked all elegance. But as he looked at the living hostages, a cold, hard truth settled in his gut. The general was right, and that terrified Anakin more than any Sith Lord ever could. The dark side was seductive, but Patton offered something far more practical effectiveness. Chapter 6. The Ghost of Rommel. High within the jagged obsidian spires of the Separatist command citadel, a new mind had awakened. It was not the hive-minded buzz of the B-1s, nor the rigid linear processing of a standard T-series. This was KTX, a super-tactical droid, with a chassis of gleaming gold and navy blue, its processor core overclocked to study the art of war, rather than just the math of it. KTX stood before a holographic waterfall of data, watching the red icon of the Republic force tearing a scar through the Jabiim sector. Subject identification anomaly. KTX vocalized its voice smooth devoid of the glitchy stutter of lesser droids. The Republic commander displays aggression levels exceeding standard parameters by 400%. Tactics are historical. The droid tilted its head. It had accessed the deep archives, the ancient warfare databases of 1,000 systems. It recognized the pattern. The feints, the blitz, the disregard for supply lines. He fights like a predator who believes he is immortal. Probability of trap success, 94%. KTX turned to the hologram of the battlefield. It didn't arrange its tanks in a defensive wall, it arranged them in a funnel. It weakened the center, pulling back its heavy artillery, baiting the bull to charge. Let him come, KTX calculated. He believes speed is his armor. We shall see how fast he moves when the ground beneath him turns to fire. The Republic column roared into the valley of Razor Ridge, a narrow throat of rock and mud, flanked by towering cliffs. Patton was in the lead ATTE, leaning out of the hatch, chewing on the end of an unlit cigar. The rain was a curtain of gray, but his instincts were screaming louder than the storm. The enemy resistance had melted away too easily. The droids were running, but they were running in straight lines, drawing the Republic deeper. Hold up. Patton slammed his hand on the hull. Halt the column drivers, stop this damn thing. General Anakin's voice came over the comms, his fighter tank hovering nearby. Why are we stopping? We have them on the run. We don't have them on the run, son, Patton growled, scanning the cliffs with his macro binoculars. They're leading us by the nose. He looked at the terrain, the high ground on 3 sides, the soft ground in the middle. It was perfect. It was textbook. I read this book, Patton whispered, a grin slowly spreading across his scarred face. I wrote a chapter on it. Suddenly, the cliffs erupted. It wasn't random fire. It was a synchronized execution. Heavy laser cannons concealed in the rock face opened fire, slamming into the flanks of the Republic walkers. Debris rained down. The retreating droids in front turned around, revealing themselves to be heavy AATs hull down in pre-dug pits. It was a kill sack. Ambush Commander Alpha shouted, "Shields up Sector 3 and 9 taking heavy fire." Patton didn't duck. He laughed. It was a deep, guttural sound that defied the explosions around him. "You magnificent bastard," he shouted at the invisible enemy commander. "I read your book." He keyed his mic. "All units pivot. Do not retreat. If you back up, you die. Charge the guns. Hug the enemy so tight their artillery can't hit us without killing their own." Chaos threatened to consume the battalion. The volume of fire was withering. A walker near Patton exploded its ammunition, cooking off in a blinding white flash. But then Patton saw something that made him pause in his tactical assessment. Anakin Skywalker leaped from his tank. The Jedi didn't seek cover. He moved directly into the path of an oncoming column of super battle droids. He was a blur of motion, his blue lightsaber a windmill of deflection. But it wasn't just defense. Anakin extended his hand, and a massive chunk of rock easily weighing 2 tons tore itself from the cliff face. With a scream of effort, the Jedi hurled the boulder through the air, crushing an AAT tank as if it were a tin can stepped on by a giant. Patton watched, mesmerized. He had called them wizards. He had called them cowards. But watching Anakin dismantle a tank with his mind, Patton saw something else. He saw the ultimate anti-armor weapon. "Look at him go," Patton muttered to Alpha, pointing at the Jedi. "He's not a priest. He's a walking 88mm cannon." Anakin landed on the hull of another tank, stabbing his blade through the armor, melting the engine block in a second. He backflipped off as the machine exploded, landing in the mud, and immediately deflecting a sniper bolt back into the shooter's head. It was graceful, yes, but it was also undeniably brutal. Patton keyed a private channel to the Jedi. "Skywalker, stop showing off and punch a hole in that left flank. I'm sending the armor through behind you." "I'm a little busy," General Anakin shouted back, force pushing a dozen droids into a ravine. "You're doing God's work, son. Keep it up," Patton yelled. He turned to his driver. "Follow that Jedi. Where he goes, we go." The battle raged for an hour, the valley turning into a slaughterhouse of burning metal and scorched earth. The trap had been perfect, but KTX had failed to account for two variables: the supernatural power of a chosen one and the sheer, stubborn refusal of George Patton to accept the geometry of defeat. By late afternoon, the firing slowed. The Republic forces had taken heavy damage. 3 walkers were burning. The infantry was battered. They had pushed through the ambush, but now they were pinned against a sheer rock wall with the droid army closing the loop behind them. They were completely encircled. Anakin deactivated his lightsaber, his chest heaving. He walked over to Patton's command post, wiping oil and rain from his face. "We're cut off," Anakin said, his voice tight. "They have the pass blocked. We can't go forward, and we can't go back. We need to call for extraction." Patton was sitting on a crate of ammo, cleaning the mud off his slug thrower with a rag. He looked up at Anakin, then out at the ring of enemy lights surrounding them in the twilight. The situation was dire. Strategically, it was a checkmate. But Patton stood up, holstering his weapon. He looked at the tired, frightened faces of the clones. He looked at Ahsoka, who was tending to a wounded trooper. Then he looked at the enemy lines. Extraction. Patton scoffed. "Why the hell would I want to leave? We have them exactly where we want them." Anakin stared at him. "General, we are surrounded. They are on every side." "Precisely," Patton grinned, and this time the fire in his eyes was blinding. "They're on the left, they're on the right, they're in front, and they're behind. They can't get away from us this time." He turned to the troops, his voice booming over the sound of the rain. "Do not pity yourselves. Pity the poor bastards who have us surrounded. We're not trapped with them, men. They are trapped with us. Tonight, we attack in all directions." High in the Citadel, KTX processed the audio intercept. Logic dictated the Republic forces should be surrendering. Instead, they were cheering. Error, KTX beeped. Human psychology, incompatible with survival algorithms. Patton looked at the map, tracing a line straight through the thickest part of the enemy line. "Rommel," he whispered to the ghost of his old adversary. "You dug a hell of a hole. Watch me drive a tank right through it." Chapter 7. Prayer and Gunpowder. The night on Jabiim was not silent. It was a cacophony of the weeping sky, the relentless drumming of rain against plastoid armor, and the distant rhythmic thumping of separatist artillery probing the darkness. Inside the hollowed-out carcass of a wrecked juggernaut transport, which served as his temporary headquarters, George Patton sat alone. A single glow lamp cast long dancing shadows against the scorched metal walls. The air smelled of stale calf ozone and the metallic tang of dried blood. Patton was writing. He used a stylus on a data pad, but the motion was that of a man scratching ink onto parchment. He pressed hard, his brow furrowed in concentration. To the Lord of Battles, he muttered, his voice a low rasp in the gloom. "Whatever you call yourself in this God-forsaken galaxy, I do not ask for forgiveness, for my profession is killing. I ask only for the opportunity to do it well." He paused, looking at his reflection in the dark screen. The alien face of the basilisk, the 4 arms he was still getting used to. He ignored the biology. The soul was the same. He set the pad down and looked into the shadows. "Chaplain," he barked. A droid shuffled forward. It was a battered protocol unit, painted with a faded red cross reprogrammed to serve as a morale officer. Its vocabulator crackled with static. "General Krell, YMAM, Unit C4P. My primary function is grief counseling and casualty notification. I don't need counseling, and I don't plan on being a casualty. Patton growled, pouring a cup of black sludge-like calf. I need a prayer for weather. The droid tilted its head, its photoreceptors blinking in confusion. Sir, meteorological data indicates a 100% probability of continued precipitation for the next 40 standard rotations. A prayer will not alter the atmospheric pressure systems of Jabiim. Patton stood up, towering over the machine. He placed a heavy hand on the droid's shoulder plating. Listen to me, you pile of bolts. There is a power greater than your algorithms. There is the will of the warrior. Now draft me a prayer. Ask the Almighty to hold back this damn rain so my tanks don't drown in the mud. Tell him if he gives me clear skies, I will give him a victory that will make the angels sing. Outside the makeshift command post, Ahsoka Tano sat cross-legged on the roof of a walker sheltered by a tarp. She wasn't meditating, she was watching. Through the Force, she could feel the mind of the general below. It was unlike anything she had ever encountered. Most minds were like streams, flowing, changing, reacting. Patton's mind was a fortress of jagged iron. It was walled off by an ego so massive, it created its own gravity. He's writing a prayer, Ahsoka whispered, opening her eyes as Anakin climbed up to join her. He's asking for the rain to stop. Anakin sat beside her, looking out at the ring of enemy searchlights sweeping the perimeter. He's superstitious, Anakin said, though his tone wasn't dismissive. Soldiers often are. It's not superstition, Master. Ahsoka frowned, shivering as a gust of wind blew rain under the tarp. It's certainty. He believes he has a contract with the universe. He believes he is chosen. She looked at Anakin with concern. I sensed darkness in him, not the Sith kind. It's not cold or manipulative. It's hot. It's bloodlust. But it's also bright. He cares about his men in his own twisted way. It confuses me. Anakin looked down at the command post. He felt it too. The raw, unrefined power of a man who lived entirely for conflict. It resonated with the dragon inside his own heart. War isn't clean, Ahsoka. The Jedi try to make it civilized, but Patton, he knows it's a butcher's yard. Maybe we need a butcher right now. Or maybe, Ahsoka countered softly, he's just a man who forgot how to be anything else. The night dragged on, the tension stretching the nerves of the clone troopers to the breaking point. They cleaned their weapons in the dark, checking charge packs, sharpening vibro knives. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and led by a madman. But as they looked toward the command tent, seeing the shadow of the general pacing back and forth, they didn't feel the urge to rout. They felt the urge to fight. Patton finished his prayer and stepped out into the mud. He looked up at the sky, letting the acidic rain wash over his face. He closed his eyes and spoke to the void. You give me the ground, he whispered fiercely. I'll provide the blood. Then, as the first hint of dawn began to bleed into the eastern horizon, the impossible happened. The wind shifted. It didn't die down. It reversed direction, blowing with a gale force that tore the heavy storm clouds apart. The relentless drumming of the rain slowed, then stopped. Within minutes, the gray ceiling broke, revealing a patch of star-strewn sky that rapidly expanded. The twin suns of Jabiim peeked over the mountains, casting long, sharp shadows across the valley. The mud, while still deep, began to steam in the sudden warmth. The clones emerged from their foxholes, staring up in disbelief. The droid army on the ridge, their sensors calibrated for heavy rain, suddenly found their optics blindingly overloaded by the glare. Anakin stood up, his jaw dropping slightly. The Force, he muttered. Did he do that? Patton walked out to the center of the camp. He didn't look surprised. He looked satisfied. He lit a fresh cigar, the smoke curling up into the clear air. He looked at the stunned Jedi and the awestruck clones. God loves a winner, Patton declared, his voice cutting through the morning silence like a whip crack. He climbed onto the hull of his lead tank, the sunlight glinting off the shark mouth paint. The stage is set. The lights are on. Now let's give the audience a show they'll never forget. Drivers, start your engines. The roar of the ITTEs coming to life was the only amen he needed. Chapter 8. Blood and Guts. The morning sun of Jabaim, a rare and blinding miracle, baked the mud into a steaming crust. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of hot plastoid. The Hawkbat Battalion was assembled in a natural amphitheater, formed by the rocky outcroppings of their defensive perimeter. They stood in formation, helmets off thousands of identical faces, looking up at the silhouette of the juggernaut transport. General Patton stood on the roof of the massive vehicle. He was backlit by the twin suns, casting a long shadow that stretched over his army. He held a riding crop in one of his 4 hands, and his helmet, polished to a mirror sheen despite the filth of the previous days, rested under another arm. He didn't use a comlink. He didn't use a hologram. He relied on the acoustics of the canyon and the sheer projection of his diaphragm. "Be seated," Patton commanded, though there were no chairs. The clones sat in the mud, their armor clanking in unison. It was an informal gesture that broke the rigid protocols of the Grand Army, signaling that this was not a briefing. This was a sermon. Patton paced the length of the juggernaut's roof, looking down at them with a gaze that felt like a physical weight. "Now I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his republic," he began, his voice low, gravelly, but carrying to the back rows. "He won it by making the other poor, dumb clanker die for his confederacy." A ripple of nervous energy went through the clones. They were bred to die. They were programmed to accept casualty rates. This man was telling them that dying was a failure. "Men, all this stuff you've heard about, holding the line and fighting retreats, is a lot of bantha dung," Patton shouted, his volume rising. "The Republic soldier loves the sting of battle. You play it marching. You play it aggressive. I won't tolerate a soldier who doesn't give a damn." He stopped pacing and pointed the crop at a group of troopers in the front row. "You are here because you are the finest soldiers the galaxy has ever seen. You are not droids. You are not programmed chips of silicon. You are flesh and blood and iron. Will, the Kaminoans might have made your bodies, but war has made your souls. We are not going to just shoot the bastards." Patton roared, his voice cracking with intensity. "We are going to cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks. We are going to murder those lousy droid lovers by the bushel." Anakin Skywalker stood off to the side, his arms crossed. He had heard speeches before, politicians droning on about democracy, Jedi masters lecturing on peace and balance. But this was raw, unfiltered primal energy. He saw the clones' eyes. They weren't glazed over with obedience anymore. They were wide pupils dilated, feeding on the general's aggression. Master Ahsoka whispered, looking uncomfortable. "He's talking about slaughter. He's enjoying it. He's giving them a reason to fight. That isn't just programming, snips." Anakin replied quietly, a dark smirk playing on his lips. "He's giving them pride." Patton continued, his face flushed, sweat dripping down his neck. "Some of you are wondering if you'll survive, whether the clankers will get you. Listen to me. I don't want to get any messages saying that we are holding our position. We are not holding anything. Let the droids do that. We are advancing constantly, and we are not interested in holding on to anything except the enemy. We're going to hold him by the nose, and we're going to kick him in the ass." He paused, letting the vulgarity hang in the air. The clones, usually forbidden from such language, exchanged glances. Then a low chuckle started in the ranks. It grew into a laugh, a human laugh. We represent the only thing between order and chaos. Patton bellowed, pacing again. And we are going to go through them like crap through a goose. He stopped at the edge of the transport, looking out toward the enemy lines, where the droid army was waiting, their metallic bodies glistening in the sun. Now there's one thing that you men will be able to say when you get back home. Patton said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. Though home was a concept these men barely understood. And you may thank God for it. 30 years from now, when you're sitting by your fireside with your grandson on your knee, and he asks you, "What did you do in the Great Clone Wars?" You won't have to cough shift him to the other knee and say, "Well, your granddaddy shoveled bantha fodder in a supply depot on Coruscant." Patton straightened up, saluting them sharp and crisp. "No, sir. You can look him straight in the eye and say, 'Son, your granddaddy rode with the great General Krell and the finest army in the galaxy, and we kicked the living hell out of them.'" For a second there was silence. Then the Hawkbat Battalion erupted. It wasn't the polite applause of the Senate. It was a roar, a primal throat-tearing cheer that shook the puddles on the ground. Helmets were thrown into the air, rifles were raised. They were no longer just clones. They were Patton's own. "All right, you sons of bitches," Patton screamed over the noise, jumping down from the roof into the mud landing with a heavy thud. "You know what to do. Mount up. I want to be in their capital by lunch." Driver Patton yelled as he scrambled up the side of the War Daddy. "Don't spare the horses. Let's go kill some robots." The engines of the ATTEs roared to life, a mechanical symphony that matched the pounding hearts of the men inside. The ground trembled as the crusade began its final charge. Chapter 9. The Meat Grinder. The battlefield of Jabiim was no longer a valley of mud. It was a cauldron of fire and screaming metal. The sun, which had briefly blessed the morning, was now choked out by the oily smoke of 1,000 burning wrecks. The air itself vibrated with the ceaseless roar of heavy laser cannons and the percussive thumping of orbital bombardment. It was here, in this churning abyss of destruction, that George Patton found his symphony. "Keep moving. If you stop, you become a target." Patton's voice tore through the comm channels, distorted by static and the background noise of explosions. He was standing in the open hatch of his command walker binoculars, pressed to his eyes, ignoring the plasma bolts sizzling past his head like angry hornets. "Alpha, take the left flank. Flank them until they get dizzy. Skywalker, punch a hole right down their throat." Anakin Skywalker was a blur of motion at the tip of the spear. He was not in a tank. He was on foot, running ahead of the heavy armor. He was a conduit of the Force, deflecting heavy repeater fire back into the droid ranks with effortless precision. He leapt onto the hull of an AAT, sliced the barrel off its main cannon, and force-pushed the crippled tank into the one behind it. It was a display of power that usually awed soldiers into silence. But today, the clones were too busy trying to keep up. "The Jedi is the hammer," Patton yelled into his headset, watching Anakin work. "We are the anvil, crush them against him." The RTTEs fired a synchronized volley, not at specific targets, but at the area grid Patton had designated. The ground erupted. Droids were not just destroyed, they were vaporized and their parts scattered like confetti in a hurricane. It was industrialized slaughter, efficient and terrifying. The resistance was stiffening. The super tactical droid KTX had deployed droidekas in overlapping fields of fire, creating a wall of death that stalled the infantry advance. Clones were falling, their white armor scorched, black bodies sliding into the craters. "General, we are pinned down at Grid Delta," a clone captain shouted over the comms. "Heavy casualties. We need to pull back." "Pull back." Patton's face flushed a deep crimson. "You dig in your spurs and you ride, I am coming to you." He slapped the hull of the War Daddy. "Driver, ram speed. Get me to Delta." The command walker surged forward, its mass driver cannon firing rhythmically. As they crested a rise, a hidden spider droid fired a heavy laser beam. It struck the command pod of Patton's walker with the force of a freight train. The impact threw the 60-ton machine sideways. Metal screamed as armor buckled. Inside the cockpit, sparks showered the crew. On the roof, Patton was thrown against the hatch rim. A shard of shrapnel, jagged hot durasteel, tore through his shoulder, embedding itself deep in the muscle. He collapsed onto the hull, blood immediately soaking his tunic, turning the olive drab to a slick, dark red. "General down," Alpha screamed. "Medic, get a medic to the lead walker." Patton lay on the hot metal, gasping for air. The pain was blinding, a white-hot poker twisted in his flesh. For a second, he saw the gray tunnel of death opening up again, just as it had in that hospital bed on Earth. "No," he hissed, spitting blood onto the armor. "Not today, not today." He grabbed the rim of the hatch with his good arm and hauled himself up. He swayed, his vision swimming, but he stood. He looked down at the wound, then at the battlefield. His walker was smoking, listing to the side. The clones nearby had stopped firing, looking at their fallen leader. "What are you looking at?" Patton roared, though his voice was a ragged croak. He keyed his comlink, overriding the medical channels. "I am not dead, and I am not leaving." He ripped a strip of cloth from his ruined sleeve and jammed it into the wound, gritting his teeth against the agony. "It's just a scratch, a badge of honor." He pulled his slug thrower with his shaking hand and fired blindly at the enemy lines. "Forward, did you hear me? Forward. If I can stand, you can fight."